Начало так называемого наступления потери противника превысили 66 тысяч человек, 7600 единиц вооружения.
That was Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu speaking Tuesday, saying that since the beginning of the offensive by Ukraine, losses by Kiev have exceeded 66,000 troops and 7,600 weapons. He said that trying to conceal the failure of the offensive, Ukraine has attacked civilian targets and presents these terrorist attacks as military victories. Well, what's going on the ground? We're going to go to Moscow and speak with analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Don, thanks for having me.
What's going on the ground?
I think one of the most important things that is not being talked about in the Western mainstream media is the Kiev regime's critical manpower problem at this point. They have been conducting a pretty much continuous level of campaign of forced conscription for pretty much over the last year, right? Since essentially since the beginning of the Russian intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict. And when I say forced conscription, I'm talking in the most extreme terms. There are literal press gangs that roam the country, grabbing anyone who, by appearances, might be eligible for conscription, forcing them into vans. The number of videos of this uploaded onto Ukrainian social media channel by Ukrainians who film these events, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these videos I have seen. You can see personally. They're not really being reported in the Western mainstream media. There is a attempt to portray the Kiev regime as, all Ukrainians are volunteering to fight for the regime. Well, at the same time, there's a notice about thousands and thousands of collaborators being arrested and executed in the country. But a little bit has started to crack. BBC came out with a piece a couple of weeks ago, Ukraine War, the men who don't want to fight. And they're talking both about a large number of military-age refugees in Europe and about the people doing everything they can to avoid conscription, often paying bribes within the country.
Those refugees, by the way, Poland announced they're starting to round them up, and they estimated 80,000 just in Poland. And that I assume that means the NATO countries are going to be sending back some chunk of the millions of Ukrainian refugees there.
Exactly. The Guardian did a piece, Bribes and Hiding at Home, the Ukrainian men trying to avoid conscription. And these are very rare admittances of what is starting to going on. And according to reports from within Ukraine, the Kiev regime military is pressing Zelensky to accelerate the mobilization, the forced conscription, and they're talking a total mobilization of a great deal of the country. Now, population-wise, in Ukraine in 1991, when they got independence, had a population just shy of 50 million people. Now, there hasn't been an official census since then, but this year, revised figures that are generally accepted coming from UN data have come out, and they now put the population of Ukraine at some 36 million, which means that since independence, the country has lost 14 million, nearly 14 million people, a great deal of them moving abroad to Russia, to Europe, but also terrible demographics within the country. Now, So officially, the population is 36 million. We know from figures put out that there are now some 6.7 million refugees from the country because of the conflict that's been raging there for the last decade. So that brings us down to around 30 million. And you won't hear this mentioned much on the Western mainstream media, but the country that the most refugees from Ukraine are in is Russia by a substantial amount, some 1.3 million, and that's not counting those who have already gained Russian citizenship. Germany and Poland, with around 1 million each, come in after that, and then down the line through EU countries. If you then consider that large parts of what are considered Ukraine in the West, i.e. Crimea, the Donbass, and most of Kherson and Zaporozhye, are no longer available for the Kiev regime to draw manpower from, that brings the population then, counting in the refugees, down to 30 million, and then an extra 10 million. You're looking at a population of 20 million to draw from, and then you're looking.
Let's mention. I just want to mention here, by the way, the ones that are now in the republics that have, seceded from Ukraine and joined the Russian Federation. They got guns shooting at the Ukrainian army. So it's not just we've denied you this, but now I'm hostile to you.
Yeah, many. I mean, it is there. There is not a policy of forced conscription, for instance, in Russian-occupied Kherson and Zaporozhye, but they have formed militias, and Donbass has been fighting them for, a decade, almost a decade now, right? Nearly 10 years. So that brings us down to a manpower pool of about 20 million, and you're looking at fighting age men between the ages of 18 and 60, with some leeway on either side. In Germany, there was a report last week that the regime has sent NATO a 71-year-old Ukrainian man to be trained for combat. So that gives you some idea.
He's older than.
The Ukrainian men have been forbidden from between the ages of 18 and 60. It was just lowered to 16 in the last 2 weeks. So any male between the ages of 16 and 60, it's illegal to leave the country, and it has been since the start of the Russian intervention, right? Because you are eligible to be turned conscripted and turned into the meat grinder. And so the country is essentially one big concentration camp. Now, large numbers of people have escaped paying bribes to get out of the country that have steadily gone up. They're talking now somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, depending on where you get through and the conditions and everything. But now the Kiev regime, Zelensky, is calling for them to be sent home. He's calling for any military-age men to be sent back from European countries. And European countries haven't officially responded yet. But there are reports now on social media of Ukrainians in Europe saying they have received notices from their government and from other sometimes local governments saying that they have 2 weeks to report back to Ukraine for conscription. This is forcing people who don't want to fight for the Kiev proxy regime. And it's gotten very, very serious. The Russian Ministry of Defense estimate of the Ukrainian casualties during their so far the badly failed offensive is now up to 66,000 lost in just the last 3 months, right? And that's killed in action. That's not counting wounded. So the numbers are extremely high. And part of this is the tactics that the Kiev regime has been forced to use. Having failed at the NATO plan for them after a few weeks of training, conducting combined arms warfare in the face of Russian air superiority, artillery, and electronic warfare overmatch has failed drastically. So they turned to what can be called mosquito tactics or human wave tactics, where they would send infantry alone in small numbers, drive them close to the front in pickups and say, run, run, run. Try to avoid the minefield, head for that tree line separating step fields over there. Dig yourself in with trenches, dig trenches, and if you survive come the morning, we'll try to get some reinforcements to you. And that is what they've been doing for over the last 2 months, and that's why their casualty numbers are so high. In order to spare what NATO military gear they have left, they've turned to what are called meat assaults by Russian analysts and media channels.
That's pathetic, really. Mark, thank you for your time, and we'll speak with you again next week.
Thanks for having me.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.